Stephanie White, wake up, snap out of it. Snap out of it. The expansion draft, you need to protect your players. You have just a few days left to do that. There's a lot of big business going on. We got teams getting sold, all types of stuff. You need to figure out how you're going to build the roster around Caitlin Clark. What are you going to do with Kelsey Mitchell? But no, I cannot believe Stephanie White is still running around, wasting time on a bunch of nonsense, and then had the nerve.
Stephanie White got caught on ESPN gushing about college teams with offensive firepower while the expansion draft is days away. And the Indiana Fever roster needs serious attention. And the Indiana Fever fan base is done with this level of distraction from the head coach. The same coach who spent last season calling Caitlin Clark's explosive scoring hero ball and treating it like a problem to be solved is now on national television explaining that offensive firepower is what separates good teams from great teams and what wins big games. Let that contradiction land for a full second. When Caitlin Clark was going nuclear against the New York Liberty, pulling up from range and putting on an offensive clinic that had the entire arena losing their minds, Stephanie White was on the sideline with her arms crossed, calling it hero ball. Now, White is explaining on ESPN that she does not think South Carolina can beat UConn because they do not have enough offensive weapons, praising UConn specifically for being so efficient and so deep on offense, using offensive firepower as her primary evaluative metric. The mental gymnastics required to hold both of those positions simultaneously is genuinely remarkable. Hero ball when the most dangerous offensive player in the WNBA does it on your own team, beautiful championship basketball when a college program does it on your television screen. This is not a minor philosophical inconsistency from a coach who is still figuring out her system. This is a documented pattern of decision-making that actively worked against the most commercially significant player in women's basketball history, while the head coach was employed specifically to help that player reach her potential.
Okay, Caitlin Clark, the return of the GOAT in year 3, coming back to win the MVP and the WNBA title. Yes, that is what she is coming back to do. Now, we had a bunch of hiccups and mental blunders last offseason. Stephanie White, Kelly Krauskopf, Amber Cox. You guys went and got DeWanna the Scammer Bonner, who ran off with the money. And let's be real, Stephanie White, you never even fully addressed that problem. You tried to sweep the DeWanna Bonner situation under the rug and say nothing about it.
The expansion draft is days away, and the gap between what White should be doing right now versus what she is actually doing is the specific thing that has the Fever fan base in an uproar that goes beyond frustration into something more pointed. Caitlin Clark needs to be protected. That is not even a discussion. But every other roster decision requires active engagement from the coaching staff and front office right now, today, not after a few more ESPN television segments about college basketball matchups. Kelsey Mitchell is a free agent. Does the Fever bring her back? At what price and in what role? And Mitchell and Clark had moments of real chemistry, but also moments that looked like two players operating in different offensive systems simultaneously, which is a problem that needs to be addressed before the contract offer is made. Aaliyah Boston needs to be deployed correctly going forward. She is talented, she is under contract, she is a quality young player. But last season's experiment of making Boston the hub of the offense and the primary decision-maker was a mismatch between player skill set and tactical role that cost the team efficiency it could not afford to lose. Boston is a scorer around the rim, a rebounder, a paint protector. She is not a point center. She is not supposed to be running the offense like a different kind of player. And using her that way was the specific tactical choice that had the effect of getting the ball out of Caitlin Clark's hands through the organizational structure of the system rather than through explicit instruction. The Fever were bad defensively last season, which is notable specifically because Stephanie White is supposed to be a defensive coach. That is her brand, the reason she was hired, the reputation she built in Connecticut. So the specific question of where the defensive pieces are for 2026 is one that requires answers before free agency windows close.
We got to look at an article. And Stephanie White had something to say that really just was mind-boggling for me. It was a real head scratcher all the way around, and we've got to dive into it. This is courtesy of Sports Illustrated, Grant Young, okay? Now, it says, Stephanie White explains why South Carolina can't keep up with UConn. First of all, why the hell are you still talking about this college stuff? What are you doing? What are you doing? Why are you still talking? You went and did your gigs. What are we talking about here? What are we talking about here? You need to be focused on the Indiana Fever right now. You're more concerned with if South Carolina can have a competitive game with UConn.
Last offseason's personnel decisions established a pattern that the Fever fan base needs Stephanie White to demonstrate she has learned from rather than repeated. And the evidence that the learning happened needs to be visible in how the 2026 offseason construction is approached. The Dana Evans situation, a recruitment that produced immediate problems and then a departure, was never properly addressed publicly. Never owned clearly, never processed in a way that communicated to the fan base and to the players what the lesson was or how the vetting process would work differently. Natasha Howard, arriving with the attitude of someone who was going to be the centerpiece of the team rather than a role player supporting Caitlin Clark, was a culture problem that a head coach is responsible for either preventing at the recruitment stage or addressing immediately when it becomes visible inside the locker room. You do not build a winning culture around a generational player by bringing in people who came to build their own brand at the expense of the team's hierarchy. You build it by recruiting players who are specifically motivated by what it means to compete alongside someone at Clark's level and who understand their role clearly before they sign. The failure to establish and maintain that clarity in last season's roster construction is the specific thing that Stephanie White needs to demonstrate she understands heading into the most important offseason of her coaching tenure. And appearing on ESPN to analyze college basketball matchups rather than being visibly engaged in that construction is exactly the wrong signal to send. Every day that White is doing media hits about South Carolina and UConn is a day that agents representing free agents the Fever need are talking to other teams whose coaches are in the office grinding the phones and building relationships rather than providing college basketball hot takes to national television audiences.
Right now, nothing, absolutely nothing, is more important than getting the proper pieces around Caitlin Clark so that we can have a successful season. I don't even know why you're talking about them right now.
The expansion draft logistics are specific and time-sensitive in a way that the public conversation about White's media appearances sometimes misses. Golden State will be selecting players from existing WNBA rosters. The Fever can protect a certain number of players, and someone is going to be lost regardless of how the protection list is constructed. That means the coaching staff and front office need to be in alignment right now about the value hierarchy of every player on the current roster, who is untouchable, who is expendable, who the organization is willing to lose in the expansion draft versus who they are going to fight to protect. The decision about which players to protect is not made well in a vacuum. It requires film sessions, contract analysis, discussions about positional need, conversations with players about their intentions and motivations, and strategic thinking about what Golden State is likely to target based on their roster construction philosophy. None of that work happens efficiently when the head coach is operating with divided attention between her WNBA responsibilities and her college basketball analysis work. And the specific timing of White's ESPN appearance during the active business period of the WNBA offseason is what makes it more than a minor inconvenience. Free agency negotiations, trade discussions, expansion draft strategy, draft preparation, these processes all overlap in the same window. They all require active engagement from the coaching staff, and they all have deadlines that do not wait for the coaching staff to finish its media commitments. The Fever front office needs its head coach present and engaged during the most consequential organizational decisions of the 2026 roster construction. And the fan base's frustration is not simply about a television appearance, it is about the signal that appearance sends regarding where the head coach's priorities actually are during a critical window. The coaching philosophy contradiction is the part of this that goes beyond the tactical and into something more fundamental about whether Stephanie White has a consistent vision for what she is trying to build around Caitlin Clark. She arrived in Indiana with a reputation as a defensive coach. That was the brand, the selling point, the theoretical completion to a roster that could already score and needed the defensive identity and accountability that White was supposed to bring from her coaching background in Connecticut. The defensive identity never materialized in the visible, consistent way that the reputation promised. The Fever's defensive numbers were poor last season in ways that directly contradicted the expectation that a Stephanie White coaching staff would prioritize that end of the floor as its primary identity. And now the same coach who built her reputation on defensive philosophy is on television explaining why offensive firepower is the decisive factor in championship basketball, which is either a genuine philosophical evolution that she has not explained or applied to her own team, or it is a coach who adjusts her stated beliefs to the context of whatever conversation she is currently having. If she genuinely believes offensive firepower is what separates good teams from great teams, then the choice to spend last season treating Caitlin Clark's offensive explosiveness as a problem to be managed rather than a weapon to be maximized was the most consequential strategic error of her coaching tenure. If she does not genuinely believe it and is simply providing content for an ESPN hit, that is a different kind of problem. But neither version of the answer produces confidence that the head coach has a coherent and consistent vision for how to deploy the most commercially significant player in women's basketball history.
The championship template that the WNBA has consistently validated across successful franchises is straightforward enough that the Indiana Fever's path forward should not require the level of philosophical debate that White's decisions have generated. The Las Vegas Aces built their success around A'ja Wilson as the unambiguous centerpiece and recruited every other piece specifically for how it complemented Wilson's capabilities. Every personnel decision filtered through the question of whether this player makes A'ja Wilson and the team around her better. The New York Liberty built around Breanna Stewart and Sabrina Ionescu as the established stars and then filled every other roster spot with players who understood their role was to support that foundation rather than to compete with it for possession and attention and usage. The Indiana Fever template should be even simpler. Caitlin Clark is the most commercially significant player the league has ever produced, the player whose performance generates the audience and the revenue that makes the franchise's current relevance possible, and every roster construction decision should filter through the question of how it makes Clark and the team around her better. That means shooters who can hit open threes when Clark draws defensive attention, wings who can guard people so Clark's offensive investment has a defensive return, bigs who can finish in the paint when Clark's penetration collapses the defense, and veterans who provide secondary playmaking rather than competing with Clark for ball handler usage. None of that is philosophically complex. It is the straightforward application of the organizational insight that one generational player properly supported produces better competitive outcomes than the same player improperly managed inside a system that was not designed for how she plays. The most direct statement of what is at stake in how the Fever approached this offseason is not about championship ambitions or roster construction philosophy. It is about Caitlin Clark's prime athletic years and what happens to them if the organizational structure around her continues to be built on contradictory priorities. Clark is doing her part. She came back from an 8-month injury absence, dominated the FIBA qualifying tournament as the MVP playing limited minutes, and arrives at the 2026 WNBA season as healthy and as motivated as she has been since establishing herself as the league's defining commercial presence. She is the reason the Fever sell tickets, the reason national media pays attention to Indiana, the reason the franchise has the commercial relevance that makes the new CBA's revenue-sharing provisions matter more for this organization than for most others in the league. The head coach who was employed to build a championship team around that player is appearing on ESPN to analyze college basketball matchups while the expansion draft countdown runs and the free agency window opens, and the institutional message that sends about where the organizational focus actually is during the league's most consequential off-season decision period is not a reassuring one. Caitlin Clark deserves a head coach whose primary visible commitment during the active off-season business period is building the best possible roster around her competitive capabilities, not a coach whose public attention is divided between her WNBA responsibilities and her media analysis work during the same window. The expansion draft is days away, and the offseason is moving whether or not Stephanie White is fully engaged with it. The question that Indiana Fever fans are asking is whether she will demonstrate the kind of focused, present, accountable leadership that the moment requires before it is too late to make the decisions that determine whether 2026 is the year this franchise finally builds something worthy of the player at its center.